Gauge lines are those vertical lines that are drawn on the Gantt chart. Between a pair of gauge lines, it is called a time bucket. For the Gantt chart, the main function of a gauge line is to tell the planner at what given date and time an schedule operation is. If you want to disable the gauge lines, all you need to do is click on this button over here, or you can come to View and click on Gauge Line to disable or enable it. If you zoom in or out, you see that the quantity, the frequency of a gauge line varies. So for example, keep looking at this position here, and you see a new gauge line appearing or disappearing depending on the zoom in on the scale that I am at the moment. That's because Opcenter APS is recalculating the frequency of gauge lines depending on the scale of the timeline. If you want to change this behavior, all we need to do is click on this button over here or right-click at the timeline header. You see that the current parameter selected is called best fit, and you can change that to minute, days, hours, or weeks. So for example, if I select days and leave the quantity equal 1, that means that you're going to have a gauge line every day at midnight. So no matter if I zoom in or out, the frequency of gauge lines remains the same. But zooming out, you can see that it pollutes your visualization, so you can quickly disable it if you need it. Right-clicking here again, if you don't want a gauge line every midnight, you can change the line reference day here to be a different time, for example 7 a.m. If you do so now, a gauge line will be drawn every 7 a.m. instead of midnight. So you see there is now an offset between the date and time and the actual gauge line, and you can change this again by changing the reference day here for the date and time. Now you see that they are aligned again. So also you can change for this configuration to be for the gauge lines only or also for the date and time. So the current parameter here defined is gauge line and times. That means that those selected parameters over here will be valid for both. But if I select gauge lines only, now the date and time will be best fit again, which is the current default behavior. Another interesting information that you can put in the timeline is the date names and the week numbers. So if you include those, all you need to do is flag those checkboxes over here, and you're going to have more information in the timeline header. Right-clicking in again, there is another parameter called bold lines between days. So if you click in here, the first gauge line of every day, it's going to be bold. In this example here, it's not very useful because you only have one gauge line per day. Let's change that. Let's say that I'm going to have one gauge line every 8 hours, starting at 7 a.m. So doing so, the first gauge line of every day is going to be bold. That helps the planner to identify when the day is beginning. So yeah. Again, for the Gantt chart, gauge lines are more visually representation to help guide the planner. But for other Opcenter APS screens, such as the utilization screen, it can have a different functionality. So you see that for the utilization screen, the gauge lines are matching with the beginning and end of a time bucket. So if I zoom in or out, the utilization got redraw to follow that pattern. So let's change this again to be once every day, and you see that my utilization also changes. So just to give you a quick understanding of this, let me schedule one order, and you see that the calculation is taking into consideration the gauge lines. I'm gonna be doing a video dedicated to the utilization windows. So for this video, that's it, and thank you.